Hi everyone. So today I'm going to be talking about type 1 diabetes, commonly known as juvenile diabetes or insulin dependent or insulin deficient diabetes. Now this video is going to be running over some of the basics of it, what causes it, treatment, and what can happen if you don't properly treat it. This is a really good video for those who have recently been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, or you may know a family member or friend who's diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. I'll kind of run over the basics of everything to give you a better understanding of it. Now, to really understand type 1 diabetes, you need to understand some of the key players that are affected by type 1 diabetes. The main one being the pancreas. Now, the pancreas is an organ found within your abdomen, pretty close to the liver. As you can see here, it kind of looks like a tail, and it has a giant blood flow that goes through it because it releases a lot of hormones and signals throughout the body. And so if you zoom in on the pancreas, you'll see these little areas called islets of Langerhans. And so these are important because they contain a couple of cells that are extremely important in type 1 diabetes. And so the two that I want to focus on that are found within the islet of Langerhans are alpha cells and beta cells. And now alpha cells release a hormone called glucagon, and beta cells release a hormone called insulin. Now, as I mentioned, the alpha cells produce a hormone called glucagon. And through a series of steps, glucagon is released into the bloodstream, makes its way back to the liver, where it forces the liver to release glucose or sugar into the bloodstream. So if our blood sugar starts to dip low, the glucagon is released in order to increase our blood sugar so that our cells can have energy. If you remember all the way back to your basic biology, glucose is broken down into ATP. And ATP is every cell's basic form of energy, or the most used form of energy at least. Now, the beta cells are extremely important when it comes to type 1 diabetes, and that is because they produce insulin. Now, insulin almost acts like a key. If you think about the cell as its cell membrane, well, that cell membrane doesn't allow for glucose or sugar to just diffuse into the cell. It has to be transported through a transport system. And what insulin does is it attaches to the cell and opens up that transport system to allow glucose or sugar into the cell so that the cell can produce energy with that glucose. So without insulin, no glucose goes into the cell, and cells are very limited on how they can produce energy. So a very delicate balancing act is occurring within the human body known as homeostasis, or essentially trying to keep something at a very consistent level. In this case, it's the blood sugar. So think about your pancreas releases the glucagon, and that in turn increases your blood sugar. To counteract that, the pancreas also releases insulin, which will decrease your blood sugar, almost acting like a yin and yang to one another. The best example I can think of this would be your heating and cooling system within your home. When your heater kicks on, it's because the temperature has dropped too low, and it's to bring the temperature back up. But if the temperature goes the opposite way and gets too high, well, then the AC kicks on to bring that temperature back down. It's a very similar thing that goes on in your body with multiple different hormones, but this is a good example here between glucagon and insulin to keep you at a consistent level of blood sugar. But what happens when we knock out one of these components? Say we get rid of insulin, just like in type 1 diabetes. Well, then unfortunately, glucagon is going to ramp up and it's going to mess with our blood sugars, and our blood sugars are going to run too high. So how does a person with type 1 diabetes lose their ability to produce insulin? Well, it happens through what's known as an autoimmune disorder or autoimmune reaction. And so typically within the human body, each cell has markers that mark that cell to say that it's part of the host or it's part of the self. And you have your white blood cells, which go around and are constantly on patrol, and they look for any cell that is not part of the host. And so they'll go and they'll match up with every single cell and see, oh, this cell is marked as part of the host, we leave it alone. Unfortunately, what happens sometimes is the white blood cell will unfortunately malfunction, and it will think that cells within the host are marked as not part of the host, and it will attack them and kill them. And this is unfortunately what happens in type 1 diabetes. Is, if you remember those islets of Langerhans, within there you have those beta cells, and unfortunately those get marked for destruction or marked to be killed by the white blood cells, thus destroying all of those beta cells, which are the cells that produce insulin. So what happens to a type 1 diabetic if they don't have any insulin given to them? What happens is essentially what happened for thousands of years before the discovery and manufacture of insulin, is a state called diabetic ketoacidosis. And essentially what this is, as you remember, insulin helps glucose transport into the cell. And so if there's no insulin released within the body, glucose cannot enter the cell. Now, a cell without glucose in it can still produce energy. Usually it does that by breaking down proteins, or essentially ketones, to produce energy. It's not as good of an option to produce energy, but it's an option, and that's what the cells resort to when there's no glucose being transported into them. So what happens after so long are these ketones build up, and they cause what's called an acidotic state, or basically a change in the pH in the blood, and they cause electrolyte abnormalities. And if either of those go on for too long, that can actually kill the patient. So how a patient gets into a state of diabetic ketoacidosis, or DKA, is typically they become sick. They don't feel like eating, which that's totally fine, but they don't check their blood sugars or give themselves insulin. Now, if you remember, the autoimmune disorder only attacked the beta cells that produce insulin. It did not attack the alpha cells that produce glucagon. So in this state, the patient is not getting any insulin because the pancreas is not producing any, and they're not injecting themselves with any because they don't believe they need any because they're sick and not eating. However, the pancreas is still producing glucagon, which is going to increase the blood sugar levels. But remember, they're no longer getting insulin, so there's nowhere for that blood sugar to go, and so those levels just keep going up and up, while the cells continue to break down ketones because they have no other energy source. And so those ketone levels will continue to rise and continue to make the acidotic state worse and the electrolyte changes worse, which eventually, if they get bad enough, can lead to death. So it's extremely important, if you or someone you know has type 1 diabetes, if they become sick, they still need to check their blood sugar, and they still need to give themselves insulin based on their blood sugar levels. So short term, if a type 1 diabetic does not control their blood sugar, that can send them into DKA. But long term, what are the issues that can occur when a patient doesn't control their blood sugar? Essentially, what can happen is what's called small vasculature damage. Your small vasculature areas are your areas in the body that have such small or such little flow of blood that just like a single red blood cell flows through. So some disease states that can occur from small vasculature damage are neuropathy, which occurs in your extremities, such as your fingers, your toes, your feet, where the neurons in those areas are damaged by the high concentration of glucose and killed, which results in loss of feeling or sensation there. Another area would be kidney failure. And this occurs because you have small vasculature in your kidneys. That area gets damaged, and then your kidneys no longer filter very well. Some other things could be erectile dysfunction or vision loss. So what you need to understand about chemistry is that molecules do not like being in a high concentration. They always try to diffuse out to decrease their concentration. So in a closed system, like the human body, glucose within the bloodstream does not like being in a high concentration. So if you're not either producing insulin or injecting insulin to decrease that concentration and move the glucose from the bloodstream into the cells, well, then the glucose has a couple of options on what it can do to decrease its concentration. It can potentially change shape so that it's no longer technically glucose. The problem with that is that it almost becomes sharp and it can damage other cells. It can also bind to other cells, such as red blood cells or neurons, which in turn can actually damage those cells. If a type 1 diabetic properly manages their disease state, they can live a relatively normal life, along with a relatively normal lifespan. So how do you manage type 1 diabetes long term? First, through education. You need to be properly educated on the disease state, what to look out for, and how to properly manage it. The next is through proper diet. Your diet is extremely important in managing your blood sugar. And then the final one is through insulin. Now the basics of insulin are that you have your long-acting and your short-acting. Now your long-acting, sometimes called basal insulin, almost acts like a background insulin. It helps to counteract that glucagon that is constantly being released by the pancreas. And your fast-acting or bolus insulin is typically to counteract the spikes in blood glucose that you're going to have from eating anything with sugar or carbohydrates in it. There's obviously quite a bit more that goes into insulin therapy in a type 1 diabetic. However, I really don't want to dive into that because I feel like that's a discussion you need to have with your healthcare provider. So I've just given you a really basic overview for either those recently diagnosed with type 1 diabetes or potentially a friend or family member of someone diagnosed with type 1 diabetes to give you the basics of what the disease is and some common things to look out for. As always, please like and subscribe to my Handy-Mann and More channel. And if there's any topics that you would like me to cover more in depth, please let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching.